But I believe that God has given me power, and there's the power of the Holy Spirit. When you lift up Jesus Christ.
In April 2026, an image went viral that no one saw coming. Donald Trump had posted an AI-generated picture of himself dressed like Jesus Christ, white robe, red sash, arms open. Within hours the internet split in half outraged, half laughing, almost nobody neutral. And in the middle of that firestorm, one 73-year-old preacher stepped forward to calm it down, and instead lit a second fire that burned even hotter than the first. Franklin Graham told the world he didn't believe Trump was trying to portray himself as Jesus Christ, and that the entire outrage was, in his words, a lot to do about nothing. It should have ended there. It didn't. Even people who had defended Graham for decades turned on him overnight. One of his own political allies called it one of the worst things she'd ever seen him say, and told him publicly that his job was to lead Trump toward Christ, not make excuses for him. For a lot of people watching, that moment raised a question that had been sitting quietly under the surface for years. Who exactly is Franklin Graham loyal to anymore? The gospel he inherited, or the political movement he helped build? And to understand how a preacher ends up in that position, defending a meme instead of preaching a sermon, you have to go all the way back to the exact moment his entire life could have gone a completely different direction, a moment that had nothing to do with politics at all, and everything to do with money, power, and a small struggling charity that a dying man handed to a 26-year-old with a broken record and no real qualifications. Most people who know the name Franklin Graham know the outline. Son of Billy Graham. Head of Samaritan's Purse. Loud voice in conservative politics. What most people don't know is how close the entire empire came to never existing at all, and how the man at the center of it built something so big that even his own supporters started asking whether one person should ever be allowed to control that much money, that much media reach, and that much religious authority all at once. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story all their own. By the mid-2000s, Franklin Graham was drawing full-time salaries from two separate organizations simultaneously. Samaritan's Purse, the disaster relief charity he'd taken over in 1979, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, the mass evangelism ministry his father built from nothing. In some years, his combined compensation from both organizations reportedly climbed past $1 million. One well-documented year put the figure around $1.2 million. Tax filings from the following years showed salary and additional compensation from both organizations stacking on top of each other, year after year, long after most donors assumed a man preaching sacrifice was living somewhere closer to the way his congregation lived. That single fact, one preacher, two massive donor-funded organizations, and a paycheck that outpaced almost every other charity leader in the country, became one of the most persistent controversies of Graham's career. Watchdog groups asked the obvious question in public, over and over. If Samaritan's Purse is a charity built on donations from ordinary people trying to feed hungry children and rebuild after disasters, why does its president take home a corporate-level salary? Graham never fully backed down from it. He let the growth of the ministry speak for itself and moved on to the next crisis zone. But here's what almost nobody talks about when they bring up the money. The empire only existed because of a series of accidents nobody planned for, starting with the fact that Franklin Graham was, by every account from people who knew him, the last person anyone expected to end up running anything at all. He was born William Franklin Graham III in July of 1952, and from the moment he could understand what his father's name meant, he resented it. Every mistake he made as a kid got measured against an impossible standard nobody else's child ever had to live up to. He answered that pressure the only way he knew how, by breaking every rule he could find. He started smoking young enough that his mother tried to shock him out of it by making him smoke an entire pack in one sitting. It didn't work. He kept smoking simply because giving up the habit would have meant admitting somebody else had control over him. By the time he reached college age, in 1970, he was already known less as a future preacher and more as Billy Graham's problem child. He enrolled at a small Christian college in Texas and lasted one semester before getting expelled for breaking curfew with a female classmate. The story moved through church circles fast, the way embarrassing stories always do when the family involved is famous. For a household whose entire public identity was built on moral leadership, having their son publicly expelled from a Christian college wasn't just embarrassing. It confirmed exactly what people were already whispering. What followed wasn't a quick recovery. It was years of drifting through campuses he never finished, jobs he never kept, and habits he never hid particularly well. He later admitted flatly that at that point in his life, A bottle of liquor and the freedom to travel meant more to him than any classroom ever could. By 1974, after nearly a decade circling around higher education, he walked away with nothing more than a 2-year associate's degree, a strange, almost embarrassing footnote for the son of the most famous evangelist alive. And here's the detail that actually explains everything that came after. Franklin Graham's problem during those years was never really disbelief. He said so himself, later, in blunt terms. His issue wasn't atheism. It was pride. He'd grown up close enough to the machinery of his father's ministry to know the message was true. He just didn't want anyone, not his father, not God, not anybody, telling him how to run his own life. So for years he lived inside that contradiction, quoting scripture with his mouth, running from it with everything else. The break came in 1974, during a trip through Europe and the Middle East. Not long before that trip, his father sat him down in North Carolina and told him plainly that there was a battle for his soul and no comfortable middle ground left to stand on. Franklin heard it and kept traveling anyway. Weeks later, alone in a hotel room in Jerusalem, still carrying the same restless habits, still planning another ordinary reckless night, something in him finally stopped. He opened a Bible instead of a bottle. He read the story of Nicodemus, the conversation about being born again, and for the first time in his life the words weren't a message his father preached to other people. They were about him. He knelt down in that room, alone, no cameras, no congregation, and gave his life over. That decision, made in private, in the middle of nowhere, with absolutely no plan attached to it, ended up reshaping 2 of the largest Christian organizations in the world. Because here's the thing nobody could have predicted. Franklin didn't come home and step straight into his father's pulpit. Instead, a mentor named Bob Pierce, the intense, half-broken founder of a tiny struggling relief charity called Samaritan's Purse, pulled him onto a brutal 6-week trip through some of the hardest mission territory in Asia. Refugee camps, leprosy colonies, war-scarred villages. Franklin watched children digging through garbage to survive. He met pastors who had paid real physical prices for their faith. Whatever had happened in that hotel room in Jerusalem stopped being theory out there. It became a conviction that faith without action wasn't worth much at all. When Bob Pierce died of leukemia in September of 1978, Samaritan's Purse was still barely functioning, a small, underfunded operation without the scale or reputation it would later carry. In 1979, at just 26 years old, with a public record of expulsion and reckless living still fresh in people's memories, Franklin Graham became its president. Almost nobody outside his immediate circle thought that decision made sense. A 26-year-old with 1 failed semester of Bible college and a 2-year associate's degree, running an international relief operation during a decade full of refugee crises and global instability. It looked, to a lot of people, like a recipe for disaster. Instead, it became one of the most dramatic turnarounds in modern Christian ministry. Over the following decades, Samaritan's Purse expanded from that tiny struggling charity into an operation working in more than 100 countries, with annual revenue eventually climbing into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Rapid response teams became a fixture of major disaster zones around the world: earthquakes, tsunamis, disease outbreaks, war. Field hospitals went up in Ebola zones in West Africa. Emergency medical units deployed during the pandemic in New York City and in Italy. Relief operations ran in Ukraine, and later in Gaza and Israel, in some of the most dangerous conditions any humanitarian organization operates in. Then came Operation Christmas Child in the early 1990s, a program so simple a child could understand it. Pack a showbox with toys and hygiene items and gospel materials, and send it to a kid in crisis somewhere in the world. The scale of it became almost impossible to comprehend. By 2016 alone, close to 11.5 million children across more than 100 countries had reportedly received boxes through the program. By 2023, the total had passed 200 million showboxes since the program began. It turned a small seasonal charity idea into one of the largest evangelism and aid pipelines on the planet, and it drew both massive praise and real criticism, because along with every toy came a gospel message, and not every parent, government, or aid organization was comfortable with that mix. By 2001, Franklin had added a second title to his resume, becoming president and CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association as well, running 2 of the largest Christian organizations in the world simultaneously, one built on mass evangelism, the other on global relief work. That's the moment the money questions really started catching up with him, because now there wasn't just one salary to examine. There were two, stacked on top of each other, both drawn from donor money, both scrutinized by reporters and watchdog groups who kept asking the same uncomfortable question in slightly different ways. How much power, and how much money, should one man be allowed to hold inside ministries built entirely on other people's trust and other people's donations? Graham never really answered that question the way his critics wanted. What he did instead was keep building. His own preaching style, once he fully stepped into it, was never going to sound like his father's later, softer sermons. It was sharper, more direct, more willing to name exact political and cultural fights instead of speaking in general spiritual terms. 2 months after the September 11th attacks, he went on national television and called Islam a wicked and violent religion, then repeated similar claims the following year on a different network. Muslim leaders and interfaith groups condemned the comments publicly, warning that language like that, from someone with his reach, risked deepening exactly the kind of hatred the country could least afford at that fragile moment. He didn't walk it back. Years later, when a college professor said Christians and Muslims worship the same God, Franklin publicly disputed her and supported the backlash that eventually cost her the job. He turned that same bluntness towards sexuality and gender, becoming one of the most consistent, most quoted critics of same-sex marriage and transgender rights inside American evangelicalism, framing both again and again as signs of a nation actively turning its back on God. In 2022, parts of a planned tour through the United Kingdom were cancelled outright after venue operators in cities like Liverpool and Sheffield pointed directly to his past comments on LGBTQ rights and Islam as reasons the events didn't fit their own policies on inclusion. That's not a small footnote. That cities in another country deciding a world-famous American evangelist's rhetoric was too much of a liability to host. Then there's Russia, which might be the single most uncomfortable chapter in the whole story. In 2014 and 2015, at the exact moment human rights organizations were documenting beatings, abductions, and public humiliation of LGBTQ people under a new Russian law targeting what the government called homosexual propaganda, Franklin Graham praised Vladimir Putin publicly for protecting children from it. He wrote it in his own ministry's magazine. He said it directly to reporters during a trip to Russia. To supporters, it was consistent with everything else he preached about protecting children and traditional values. To critics, it looked like open praise for an authoritarian government's crackdown on a vulnerable minority, coming from a man who spent the rest of his time condemning American churches for becoming too accepting of exactly those same people. There's also a moment in January of 2015 that shows exactly how much real-world weight his words could carry, far beyond just stirring up online arguments. Duke University had approved a plan to broadcast the Muslim call to prayer for a few minutes each Friday from its chapel bell tower. Franklin Graham attacked the decision on social media almost immediately, calling it an insult to the Christian faith and openly urging donors to pull their financial support from the university. Within about a day, Duke reversed the decision entirely, citing what it called credible and serious security concerns, and moved the prayer call to a much smaller, less visible setup near the chapel steps instead. Graham publicly praised the reversal as the right decision. Whether you saw that as a principled stand or as one man's social media post pressuring a major university into backing down within 24 hours, it proved something important. By that point in his career, Franklin Graham's words weren't just sermons anymore. They were leverage. Even people who had spent their careers defending Billy Graham's legacy started getting uncomfortable with where Franklin was taking it. In 2015, after he publicly urged police officers to take back American cities and suggested that violence against minority communities would decrease if people simply obeyed law enforcement, a number of fellow evangelical leaders spoke out against him directly. For them, his comments landed at a moment that called for careful, wise language, and instead deepened exactly the kind of division the country didn't need. It was a strange thing to witness, a man defending his father's legacy while other people who'd spent decades close to that same legacy openly worried he was damaging it. There's also a quieter tension running underneath all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines, the question of legacy itself and who actually gets to carry a name like Graham forward. Billy Graham didn't hand his ministry to Franklin because Franklin had proven himself early. He handed it to him because, by the 1990s, there was genuinely no one else left standing who understood both the machinery of mass evangelism and the machinery of global relief work well enough to keep either one running. In 1995, in Toronto, an aging and increasingly frail Billy Graham found himself physically unable to continue a crusade partway through and asked Franklin to take the pulpit in his place. It wasn't a ceremonial gesture. It was survival. From that point forward, resources, media attention, and institutional trust inside the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association began quietly shifting toward Franklin's own festivals, long before any formal announcement made it official. By the time Billy Graham held his final crusade in New York in 2005, the succession had already happened in every way that mattered. The public simply hadn't caught up to it yet. That kind of succession, inherited rather than earned through consensus, tends to create exactly the kind of resentment that never fully goes away. Some inside evangelical circles have spent years quietly questioning whether Franklin Graham was ever really chosen for his theological judgment, or whether he simply happened to be the son standing closest to the pulpit when his father could no longer stand behind it himself. That question matters more than it might seem, because it explains a lot about why Franklin's critics inside the church, not just outside it, have never fully gone away either. To them, every controversial statement, every political alliance, every dollar of compensation is proof of the same underlying worry, that inheriting a legacy isn't the same thing as deserving one. And then, of course, there's the politics that eventually swallowed almost everything else. By the 2016 election, Franklin Graham's role in American conservative politics had become impossible to separate from his religious identity. Some commentators credited him directly with helping Donald Trump connect with evangelical voters. Once Trump was in office, Graham defended him through scandal after scandal, at times suggesting the ferocity of Trump's critics bordered on something close to demonic, and repeating the idea that God has often used deeply flawed men to carry out larger purposes. Under that framing, an ordinary presidency started sounding, in Graham's telling, less like standard politics and more like a rescue mission for the country's soul. He toured all 50 state capitals under something he called the Decision America Tour, warning Christians that the country was approaching a genuine moral tipping point and urging them back into political life because, in his view, only a return to God could actually fix what was broken. Over time, that message got sharper and more apocalyptic. Elections stopped sounding like ordinary civic events in his sermons and started sounding like battles between good and evil. Abortion, LGBTQ rights, the general direction of the culture, all of it got folded into one continuous spiritual war, with Graham positioning himself as one of its loudest generals. Which brings the story right back to where it started. That AI-generated Jesus image controversy in April 2026 wasn't really a strange, isolated moment. It was the natural endpoint of 40 years of a preacher gradually fusing his religious authority with a political movement, until defending a controversial political ally became something close to a reflex, even when the moment called for something closer to spiritual clarity. When Graham dismissed the backlash as nothing worth worrying about, he wasn't just defending one image. He was defending an entire pattern he'd built his whole later career on, the pattern of treating political loyalty and religious conviction as basically the same thing. Now, at 73, Franklin Graham shows absolutely no sign of slowing down or softening any of it. In January of 2026, he called for a nationwide moment of prayer and repentance, describing America as morally sick and pointing to crime, addiction, and cultural collapse as unmistakable evidence that judgment was coming if the country refused to turn back. He's been saying versions of this warning for well over a decade now. As far back as 2012, he was telling audiences that an upcoming election could be the country's last real chance before facing consequences he framed in explicitly biblical terms. None of that language has softened with age. If anything, it's gotten more urgent, more specific, and more tightly wound around whatever political fight happens to be dominating headlines that particular week. So where does that leave the actual story of Franklin Graham? Not the caricature either side likes to use, not the fearless truth-teller his supporters describe, and not the cynical power-hungry operator his harshest critics paint him as. Somewhere underneath both of those versions is a much stranger, much more human story. A rebellious kid who spent his entire adolescence fighting a name he didn't ask for. A 26-year-old handed control of a dying charity almost nobody expected him to save. A man who built one of the largest disaster relief operations on earth using nothing but stubbornness, conviction, and the same refusal to back down that once got him expelled from college for breaking curfew. That stubbornness built something genuinely massive on the humanitarian side. Hospitals in Ebola zones, emergency relief in war-torn countries, aid reaching disaster survivors most Americans will never hear a single news story about. And that exact same stubbornness, pointed toward culture and politics instead of disaster relief, built 4 decades of controversy that shows no sign of slowing down at 73 years old. Maybe that's the real revelation buried underneath all the headlines, all the controversies, all the tax filings and cancelled tour dates and viral political moments. Franklin Graham never actually changed who he fundamentally was. The same total unwillingness to be controlled that got a teenager expelled from a Christian college in 1970 is the exact same trait driving a 73-year-old man to defend a politically controversial ally in 2026, no matter how much backlash it brings. He didn't trade rebellion for faith when he knelt down in that hotel room in Jerusalem back in 1974. He just found a cause big enough and permanent enough to spend the rest of his life rebelling on behalf of instead of against. Whether history eventually remembers him as one of the boldest religious voices of his generation, or as the man who helped drag American evangelicalism deeper into partisan politics than it had ever gone before, one thing about Franklin Graham's story refuses to change no matter which angle you look at it from. He has never, not once in 73 years, learned how to do anything quietly. And that's really what makes this story worth telling at all. Not because Franklin Graham is uniquely villainous, and not because he's uniquely heroic either. It's because he might be one of the clearest examples alive today of exactly what happens when personal rebellion, generational pressure, real humanitarian conviction, and raw political power all get poured into the same single human being, decade after decade, with no off switch ever installed. Most people who inherit a famous name either collapse under the weight of it or quietly step aside and let it fade. Franklin Graham did neither. He grabbed it, argued with it, ran from it, came back to it, and then spent the rest of his life bending it into something that looked less like his father's ministry and more like his own private war, fought simultaneously against disaster, against disbelief, and against a culture he was convinced was slipping away in real time. The tragedy and the triumph of Franklin Graham's story are, frustratingly, the exact same story. The stubbornness that got a 19-year-old expelled from a Christian college for breaking curfew is the same stubbornness that pulled emergency medical teams into Ebola zones nobody else wanted to go near. The refusal to back down that turned a single Facebook post into a university reversing a decision in under 24 hours is the same refusal to back down that kept a struggling little relief charity alive long enough to become a 100-country humanitarian operation. You cannot separate the parts of Franklin Graham people admire from the parts of Franklin Graham people can't stand, because they were never actually separate traits to begin with. They were always the same trait, aimed in different directions depending on the year. So when people ask what Franklin Graham is really revealing at 73, sitting behind a pulpit that used to belong to the most famous preacher in American history, defending political controversies most pastors would run from, maybe the honest answer is that he isn't revealing anything new at all. He's simply run out of reasons to hide the one thing that's been true about him since he was a teenager smoking an entire pack of cigarettes out of pure defiance. Franklin Graham was never going to spend his life quietly agreeing with anyone. Not his mother. Not his father. Not his critics. Not even, at times, the softer, gentler version of the faith his father spent decades building. He was only ever going to spend it fighting for whatever he believed was true, as loudly and as publicly as the largest platform in American religion would allow him to.